The courtroom was already silent when my mother looked across the room and said the words she had been saving for years. She has never been capable of making serious decisions. My father nodded beside her. He looked calm, almost concerned, as if he were not the same man who had pushed me out of his house on Christmas Eve with a trash bag in my hands. I sat at the other table and said nothing. That was the part they misunderstood. They thought my silence meant I had nothing to say. They did not know I had learned, long before that morning, that some truths became more powerful when someone else was forced to prove them. The judge looked down at the documents in front of him. My mother shifted in her chair. My father leaned toward his attorney and whispered something. I watched them. For years they had told people who I was. Unstable. Dependent. Naive. A burden. Now they were asking a judge to believe that I was incapable of controlling my own life. There was only one problem. They did not know who my grandfather had prepared me to become. And they certainly did not know what he had left behind. But that morning in court was not where my story began. It began the night before. Christmas Eve. I remember standing in the hallway of my parents' house with a trash bag in one hand and my coat in the other. The house was warm. The Christmas tree was still glowing in the living room. There were wrapped presents underneath it, soft music playing from somewhere near the kitchen, and plates sitting on the dining table as if we were still a family preparing to celebrate. I had never felt more outside of that house. My mother stood near the doorway with her arms crossed. You wanted to be independent, she said. So be independent. I looked at my father. He would not meet my eyes. Then he pushed the trash bag toward me. Take your things. I did not argue. I had learned that arguing only gave them another reason to call me difficult. My mother continued talking. She always did when she was angry. She told me I had been ungrateful. She said I expected everyone to take care of me. She reminded me of every mistake I had made, every bill I had struggled to pay, every decision they believed proved that I could not survive without them. Her words came quickly. Mine did not. I finally picked up the bag. Okay, I said. That one word seemed to irritate her more than an argument would have. My father opened the door. Cold air rushed into the hallway. For a second, I stood there looking at the Christmas lights reflected in the glass. Then the door closed behind me. The lock clicked. I was outside. I had $182 in my wallet, a phone with a dying battery, a trash bag filled with clothes, and an old black card that had been sitting in my wallet for years. My grandfather had given it to me when I was younger. I had never understood why. It did not look like a normal bank card. There was no familiar logo on the front, only a small number and his initials. He had pressed it into my hand once and told me something I had almost forgotten. Keep this. I had laughed at the time. For what? He had looked at me for a long moment. You will know. Then he had added something stranger. Use it only when you have nowhere else to go. I never asked him what he meant. My parents had always told me my grandfather was old-fashioned. They said he liked making dramatic statements. Later they told me he was confused. I believed them. That was the part one would regret most. Not because I had trusted my grandfather too little. Because I had trusted the people who kept me away from him. That night I found a cheap place where I could sit until morning. I barely slept. I kept thinking about the door closing. About my mother's voice. About the trash bag. About the $182. And finally about the black card. At 6 in the morning, I took it out of my wallet and turned it over in my hand. For the first time I wondered why my grandfather had given it to me. I did not know then that he had been preparing for that exact moment. I did not know he had left instructions. I did not know there were letters I had never received. And I certainly did not know that the people who had just thrown me out were about to discover that the girl they had spent years calling helpless had been protected by someone they had underestimated. I only knew one thing. I had nowhere else to go. So the next morning I walked into the bank connected to that strange black card. And the moment the manager saw it, his entire expression changed. The first strange thing was not the balance. It was the bank manager's face. He looked at the black card in my hand, then looked at me, and for several seconds he said nothing. I had expected questions, maybe even embarrassment. Instead, he stood from behind his desk. Could you come with me, please? I glanced toward the other customers. Is there a problem? No, he said quickly. Then he paused. Not the kind you think. That answer did not make me feel better. I followed him through a glass door into a quiet hallway. My shoes sounded too loud against the polished floor. I was still wearing the same coat from the night before. I had not had time to change. My trash bag was gone, but I still carried everything I owned in one small suitcase. The contrast made me uncomfortable. The bank was warm and spotless. I felt like I did not belong there. The manager opened a private office and motioned for me to sit. He closed the door. Then he looked at the card again. Where did you get this? My grandfather gave it to me. What was his name? I told him. The manager's expression changed again. This time there was recognition. He picked up the phone and made a short call. He did not explain who he was calling. He only gave my grandfather's name and a reference number printed on the back of the card. Then he waited. I watched his fingers resting on the desk. He was not nervous, but he was careful. That made me nervous. Finally, he put the phone down. Your grandfather established a private arrangement with this bank many years ago. I stared at him. What kind of arrangement? He folded his hands. One that was designed to be accessed under very specific circumstances. I almost laughed. I had spent the night trying to figure out where I could sleep. Now a bank manager was talking to me as if I had walked into a locked room carrying a secret. My grandfather never told me about an arrangement. He may not have been permitted to. Why? The manager looked at me for a moment before answering. Because he wanted you to come here by choice. That sentence stayed with me. By choice. I thought about the night before. I had not chosen to leave my parents' house. I had been thrown out. And yet somehow that was exactly what had brought me there. The manager opened a drawer and removed a thin folder. There was no company logo on it. No ordinary account number. Only my grandfather's name. He placed it on the desk but did not open it. Before we continue, I need to verify your identity. I handed him my identification. He checked it carefully. Then he asked a few questions about my grandfather. His birthday. His middle name. The name of the town where he had grown up. Things I remember because he had told me stories about them when I was younger. The manager compared my answers with the records. Then he nodded. Everything matches. I felt my shoulders loosen slightly. So what is this? He opened the folder. Inside was a series of documents, all neatly organized. At the top was a handwritten note. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My grandfather's. My throat tightened. I reached toward it, but the manager gently placed his hand over the page. There is one more verification. I pulled my hand back. What? He looked directly at me. Does your family know you are here? I thought about my father standing in the doorway. My mother with her arms crossed. The lock clicking behind me. No. Are you expecting them to contact you? I don't know. He nodded slowly. Then he closed the folder. Good. That single word made me uncomfortable. Why is that good? Because your grandfather left very specific instructions concerning your privacy. I stared at him. My privacy? Yes. He leaned back in his chair. He anticipated that other people might try to gain information about this arrangement. The room suddenly felt smaller. I thought about my parents. They had always wanted to know where I was, who I spoke to, what I spent, what was in my bank account. Even when I was an adult, they treated ordinary decisions as things they had the right to approve. I had always called it controlling. My grandfather had apparently called it something else. Preparation. The manager opened another drawer. This time he removed a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front. I stared at it. When was this written? Several years ago. By him. Yes. I reached for the envelope. My fingers were shaking slightly. I turned it over. There was a small instruction written across the back. To be opened only after she arrives here alone. I looked up. What does this mean? The manager did not answer immediately. Instead, he pushed a glass of water toward me. Your grandfather believed there might come a day when you would have nowhere else to go. My chest tightened. Those were almost the exact words he had used when he gave me the black card. I looked down at the envelope again. For years, I had thought that memory was nothing more than an old man's strange way of making me feel protected. Now I wondered if he had been preparing for something he already knew was coming. The manager stood and walked toward a secure computer terminal. "I can show you one part of the arrangement," he said. "One part?" "Yes." He entered a password. Then another. A screen appeared. I leaned forward. The manager looked at me before turning the monitor around. "You should understand," he said quietly, "that what you are about to see may change everything you thought you knew about your grandfather." I stared at the screen and waited for the number to appear. I had been prepared to see a few $1,000s, maybe enough to pay for a room, maybe enough to buy food, replace my clothes, and get through the next few months without calling my parents. I was not prepared to see $63.8 million. The number appeared on the screen without any warning. For several seconds, I honestly thought I had read it wrong. I leaned closer. The manager did not say anything. He simply watched me. I counted the digits again. 6, 3, 8 million. My mouth went dry. That can't be right. The manager remained calm. "It is." I looked at him. "Are you sure?" "Yes." He turned the screen slightly toward himself and checked the account details again. Then he looked back at me. "The amount shown here represents the liquid assets currently assigned to the structure your grandfather established." I stared at the screen. Liquid assets. That sounded like something that belonged to someone else. Not me. Not the woman who had walked into that bank carrying almost everything she owned in one suitcase. Not the woman who had been thrown out of her parents' house less than 24 hours earlier. I looked down at my hands. They were still trembling. The manager noticed. "You can take a moment." I did. I did not cry. I did not smile. I did not ask how I could spend it. I just sat there, trying to understand how the same person who had been told she was worthless could suddenly be sitting in front of a number that large. Then I remembered my grandfather. His old house. His quiet voice. The way he used to watch me whenever I doubted myself. He had never talked about money with me. At least not the way my parents did. My parents treated money like a weapon. They used it to remind me who paid for things, who had helped me, who had the right to make decisions. My grandfather had treated it differently. He had once told me that money was only useful if it gave a person the freedom to make honest choices. At the time, I thought he was talking about something much smaller. Now I wondered if he had known exactly what he was talking about. The manager opened another document. "This is not the entire estate." I looked up. "What do you mean?" "The $63.8 million is the liquid portion." He paused. "There are also properties." I said nothing. "Investment holdings." Another pause. "Private interests and other assets." I stared at him. How much did he leave? The manager shook his head. "I don't want to give you an incomplete figure until the remaining assets are fully verified. There are several separate structures involved." That answer should have relieved me. Instead, it frightened me. Because suddenly the money was no longer the biggest mystery. My grandfather had planned something. Carefully. Quietly. And for some reason he had expected me to need it. The manager opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a single page. He read it first. Then he looked at me. "Your grandfather included instructions about how this information should be presented to you." "What did he say?" The manager hesitated. Then he handed me the paper. I recognized his handwriting immediately. There were only a few lines. He had written that the inheritance was not to be revealed casually. It was to remain protected until I personally appeared at the bank and presented the black card. The manager explained that the arrangement had been designed to keep other family members from accessing the assets. My stomach tightened. "Other family members?" "Yes." "Who?" He did not answer. He did not need to. I already knew. My parents. For years, they had insisted my grandfather was becoming confused. They told me he repeated himself. They said he forgot important things. They told me I should not take his financial opinions seriously. They slowly convinced me that visiting him too often would only create problems. And eventually I stopped asking questions. I looked at the documents again. What if my parents find out? The manager's expression became more serious. That is exactly why your grandfather created these protections. I swallowed. So he knew. I cannot tell you what he knew. The manager carefully chose his next words. But he clearly anticipated interference. Then he reached for a small device on the desk. There is one more thing. He pressed a button. A recording began. At first there was only static. Then I heard a familiar voice. My grandfather. Older. A little weaker than I remembered. But unmistakably his. If you are hearing this, he said, then something has gone badly wrong. I stopped breathing for a second. The manager lowered his eyes. I listened. My grandfather did not mention the money. He did not celebrate the fortune. He did not tell me how wealthy I was. Instead, he spoke about trust, about protecting decisions, about keeping certain documents safe. Then his voice became quieter. There are people who will tell you I was confused. My fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. He paused. They may tell you that I did not understand what I was doing. I looked at the manager. He was watching the recording screen. My grandfather continued. If they say that, do not argue with them. Another pause. Let the records speak. The recording ended. The room became completely silent. I stared at the black screen. For the first time since I had entered the bank, I stopped thinking about the money. I started thinking about my grandfather's final warning. My parents had always said he was confused. They had always said he was no longer capable of making serious decisions. But the man I had just heard sounded neither confused nor helpless. He sounded prepared. The manager closed the file. There is much more for you to review. I looked at him. Then why didn't he tell me? The manager's answer was quiet. Perhaps because he believed you would need to discover the truth at the right time. I looked down at the black card lying on the desk. Only yesterday it had felt like an old piece of plastic from a man I had lost. Now it felt like the first key to a life I had never known existed. And somewhere inside the bank's protected files were the answers to the question I had been too afraid to ask. Why had my grandfather spent years preparing for the day I would need him most? I did not know the answer yet. But the next file would show me something far more painful than the number on that screen. It would show me the letters he had written to me. Letters I had never received. The first letter had my name on it. The second one did too. So did the third. I stared at the stack on the desk and felt something inside me go completely still. I had spent years believing my grandfather had stopped writing to me. My parents had said he was too sick. Then they said he was confused. Later, they told me he had become difficult and forgetful, and that his letters were mostly nonsense. I believed them. Now I was looking at a pile of envelopes, all addressed to me, all written in the same familiar handwriting. My grandfather's handwriting. The bank manager had placed them in front of me without saying much. These were preserved under the instructions attached to your grandfather's estate. I picked up the first envelope. There was a date on it. 5 years earlier. I remembered that year clearly. I had asked my mother whether Grandpa had sent anything for my birthday. She had shrugged. He probably forgot. I had believed her. My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope. The letter was short. He asked how I was doing. He asked about my work. He mentioned a small garden project he had started behind his house. Then he wrote something that made my chest tighten. He said he had been waiting for my reply. I read the sentence again. Then again. There had never been a reply because I had never seen the letter. I opened another. Then another. Some were months apart. Some were only weeks apart. In one, he asked why I had suddenly stopped visiting. In another, he said he hoped I was not angry with him. In another, he mentioned that he had tried calling me several times. I remembered those years. I remembered my mother telling me he was too tired to speak. I remembered my father saying I should not bother him. I remember being told that my grandfather had asked about me less and less. But the letter said something completely different. He had been asking about me all along. He had been waiting. And someone had made sure I never knew. I placed the letter down. The bank manager stayed silent. I appreciated that. I did not need someone telling me how I should feel. I already knew. It was not anger. Not yet. It was something quieter. The painful realization that entire pieces of my life had been edited without my permission. I opened another file. This one contained copies of communications between my grandfather's advisors and the people around him. There were notes about his health, his finances, his legal decisions, and there were references to my parents. My attorney arrived later that morning. She had been recommended by the bank and had already reviewed part of the estate documents. She sat across from me and carefully read the letters. "This is important," she said. I looked at her. "Because he wrote to me? Because someone prevented those letters from reaching you." She placed one document beside another. Then she pointed to a note written by one of my grandfather's advisors. The note said my parents had repeatedly described him as mentally incapable of managing his affairs. My attorney looked at me. "Did you believe that?" "Yes." "Why?" I thought about it. "Because they told me." She nodded. "That is exactly what concerns me." She began reviewing the estate records. My grandfather had not made one sudden decision. He had planned his estate over several years. There were meetings with attorneys, financial reviews, updated documents, medical assessments, written instructions. Everything had dates. Everything had signatures. Everything had witnesses. Nothing looked random. Nothing looked confused. My grandfather had known exactly what he was doing. And then I saw something that made the entire picture darker. A medical evaluation from one of his doctors. It stated that he was mentally capable of making financial and legal decisions during the period when his estate plan had been created. I stared at the page. My father had told me Grandpa barely knew what day it was, but the records showed something else. My grandfather had been thinking ahead. He had known there might be a fight over his decisions. He had prepared for it. My attorney leaned back. "Your parents may have spent years creating a version of him that people would believe." I looked at the letters. "And me." She was quiet for a moment. "They may have created a version of you too." That sentence stayed with me, because suddenly I understood something. If my parents wanted people to believe my grandfather was incompetent, then his wishes could be challenged. And if they wanted people to believe I was incapable, then they could eventually challenge me too. The inheritance suddenly felt less like a fortune and more like a target. I asked my attorney what I should do. She answered immediately. "Nothing." I looked at her. "Nothing. Do not confront your parents. Do not accuse them. Do not threaten them. Do not tell them what you found." She gathered the letters into a neat stack. "Let the evidence speak first." I sat quietly. For most of my life I had thought silence meant losing. Now, for the first time, someone was telling me silence could be a strategy. My attorney placed the sealed documents into a protective folder. "We will preserve everything." I nodded. Then she looked at one final page. Her expression changed. "What?" She turned the page toward me. At the top was my grandfather's name. Below it was a statement written years before his death. My attorney read the first few lines. Then she stopped. "This is different." I looked at her. "How?" She pointed to the final paragraph. My grandfather had written about what would happen if certain family members tried to control his estate after his death. He had not merely predicted an argument. He had predicted the exact kind of attack I was now facing. And beneath that warning was one sentence that made my stomach drop. It said that if they ever tried to take control of what he had left me, the original evidence should be released. My attorney slowly closed the folder. Then she looked at me. "I think your grandfather knew this was coming." And for the first time, I understood that the inheritance was only one part of the secret he had left behind. My parents found me 3 days after I entered the bank. They did not ask if I was safe. They did not ask where I had been sleeping. They did not ask whether I had eaten. My mother's first message was simple. "We need to talk about your grandfather's money." I stared at the screen for several seconds. I did not answer. A second message appeared. Then another. "You cannot handle this by yourself." That one almost sounded like the woman who had thrown me out of her house with a trash bag. Almost. But there was something different now. Fear. Not mine. There. I had followed my attorney's instructions. I had not told my parents what I had discovered. I had not mentioned the $63.8 million. I had not told them about the properties. I had not told them about the letters. Most importantly, I had not told them about the recordings. I simply stopped explaining myself. That seemed to make them more desperate. My father called that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. Then again. Finally, I listened. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath it. You need to understand something. Whatever your grandfather left behind belongs to the family. You cannot just take control of everything without discussing it with us. I listened until the message ended. Then I saved it. My attorney had told me to save everything. Every call. Every message. Every email. Every attempt to contact me. She had explained that people often revealed more when they believed nobody was paying attention. I was beginning to understand what she meant. My mother called that evening. I answered this time. She sounded softer. Almost loving. Sweetheart, I know you're confused. I closed my eyes. That word again. Confused. It was the same word they had used about my grandfather. Now they were using it about me. I think you need help managing this, she continued. This is far too much responsibility for you. I said nothing. She filled the silence. That money can destroy people. Still I said nothing. You have never handled money well. I almost responded. Then I remembered my attorney. Let the evidence speak. So I asked one question. Why do you need to manage it? Silence. For the first time, my mother did not have an immediate answer. Then her voice changed. We are your parents. That doesn't answer the question. She became angry. She accused me of being selfish. She said my grandfather would never have wanted me to turn against my family. I listened. Then I ended the call. I saved the recording. The next morning my father sent me a message. It was not emotional this time. It was a warning. You are making a serious mistake. I gave the message to my attorney. She read it once. Then she placed her phone on the desk. Do not respond. I nodded. They are going to escalate, she said. How do you know? Because they are already doing it. She showed me a report. Someone had been asking questions about me. Not ordinary questions. Where I lived. Where I went. Who I met. What kind of car I used. Whether I had spoken to anyone at the bank. I felt a cold pressure settle in my chest. Who is doing this? My attorney looked at me. A private investigator. I stared at her. My parents hired someone to follow me? We don't have the complete proof yet. She paused. But we will. I looked out the window. Cars moved along the street below. People walked past without knowing anything about me. Without knowing that my parents had spent years telling me I could not take care of myself. And now they were spending money to watch where I went. The irony was almost too obvious. But I did not laugh. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired. My attorney noticed. This is where you need to be careful, she said. I looked at her. They want you to react. Why? Because anger gives them a story. She leaned forward. They want to say you're unstable. If you threaten them, they will use it. If you lose your temper, they will use it. If you send one message they can twist, they will use it. I understood. So I say nothing. Not nothing, she said. You document. That became my routine. I kept records. I forwarded every message. I saved every voicemail. I wrote down dates, times, locations. I stopped posting anything online. I changed routines. I stayed close to people I trusted. And I waited. Then another person entered the story. A doctor who had known me for years agreed to review some of the claims my parents were making about my mental and emotional state. She did not need to defend me dramatically. She simply reviewed the facts. My history. My records. My work. My decisions. Her conclusion was clear. There was no medical basis for the picture my parents were trying to create. My attorney placed the report into the growing file. We keep building. I looked at the stack of documents. How long will this take? She paused. Until they make a mistake. I understood what she meant. My parents had spent years controlling the story. Now they were trying to control the money. But the more they pushed, the more evidence they created. Then late one afternoon my attorney called me. Her voice was different. They filed. I knew immediately what she meant. What did they file? A petition claiming you are incapable of managing your inheritance. I sat down slowly. My parents had finally chosen the stage they wanted. A courtroom. A judge. A public record. They believed it would prove I was the helpless daughter they had always described. They did not know that every accusation they had made was about to become evidence. And this time they had put their own names on it. My mother arrived at the hearing carrying a folder so thick it made her story look true. She placed it carefully on the table in front of her attorney, then looked across the courtroom at me. There was almost a smile on her face. She believed this room would finally prove what she had been telling people for years. That I was incapable. That I was unstable. That I could not be trusted with my own decisions. My father sat beside her, wearing the expression of a worried parent who had come to save his daughter from herself. I knew that expression. I had seen it many times. Only now there was a judge watching, and a court reporter recording every word. My attorney sat beside me. She leaned toward me before the hearing began. Remember what we discussed? I nodded. Don't react. I won't. Let them tell their story. I looked across the room at my parents. They're going to make you angry, she continued. I know. She gave me a small nod. Then let the evidence do the talking. The hearing began. My mother's attorney stood first. He described my parents as concerned and loving. He said they had watched me struggle for years. He said I had made poor financial choices. He said I had become emotionally unstable. Then he began talking about my grandfather's inheritance. He described the fortune as something far beyond what any ordinary person should be expected to manage. My mother lowered her head at the right moments. My father sighed quietly. It was almost like watching a performance. Then my mother was called to speak. She took the witness seat. She looked toward the judge. I only want to protect my daughter, she said. Her voice shook slightly. I have always tried to protect her. I kept my eyes on the table. She began describing my childhood. A mistake I had made at school. A job I had left. A bill I had once struggled to pay. Small moments. Ordinary mistakes. But she presented each one as evidence that something was wrong with me. She said I had difficulty making decisions. She said I became overwhelmed easily. She said I depended on my parents for everything. Then she said something that made the room feel colder. She has never been capable of handling serious responsibility. I looked at the judge. He was writing something down. My mother continued. She described herself as the person who had always stepped in when I could not manage my own life. She did not mention the trash bag. She did not mention Christmas Eve. She did not mention the door. She did not mention the messages demanding access to my grandfather's estate. And she certainly did not mention the private investigator. My father took the stand next. He spoke even more. He described himself as patient, responsible, protective. He said my grandfather had become confused near the end of his life. According to my father, my grandfather could no longer understand complicated financial matters. That claim was important, because my grandfather's estate documents told a very different story. My father kept talking. He said my grandfather had been vulnerable. He said people around him may have influenced his decisions. Then he looked directly at me. I am afraid she is being manipulated. I almost looked around to see who he meant, but I knew. He meant the attorneys, the bank, the doctors, everyone except himself. My attorney did not interrupt. She simply took notes. When my father finished, the judge asked a simple question. Do you have evidence that the deceased lacked mental capacity when these documents were created? My father hesitated. His attorney answered, We have concerns, Your Honor. The judge looked at him. That was not my question. The room became quiet. My father shifted in his chair. My attorney finally stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not attack my parents. She simply placed a folder on the table. We are not asking the court to trust my client. she said. She paused. We are asking the court to examine the evidence. The first document was my grandfather's medical evaluation. It showed that he had been assessed by a qualified physician during the period when his estate documents were prepared. The evaluation stated that he was mentally capable of making financial and legal decisions. My mother's expression changed. My attorney placed another document beside it, then another. Estate reviews, legal consultations, financial records, signed instructions, dates, witnesses. My grandfather had not made one careless decision. He had spent years preparing. Then my attorney introduced the letters. The letters my parents had said never existed. She showed the court that my grandfather had repeatedly written to me. She showed records indicating that he had tried to maintain contact. Then she explained that those communications had never reached me. My mother began shaking her head. That isn't what happened. The judge looked at her. Please wait until your attorney advises you. She stopped. For the first time, I saw something I had rarely seen on my mother's face. Uncertainty. My attorney continued. Then came the medical testimony. The doctor who had reviewed my records explained that there was no medical basis for the picture my parents had created. She described me as capable of making decisions and managing ordinary responsibilities. She did not praise me. She did not need to. She simply stated the facts. The room changed slowly. At the beginning, everyone had listened to my parents as concerned family members. Now people were listening to them as witnesses whose claims had to be tested. My father's attorney tried to recover. He argued that wealth itself created risk. My attorney agreed. Then she calmly pointed out that my grandfather had already accounted for that risk by establishing professional financial safeguards. The judge looked through the documents. He asked several questions. My parents answered. Then he asked the same questions again in slightly different ways. Their answers began to shift. The confidence they had carried into the courtroom was disappearing. I remained silent. Not because I was afraid, because there was nothing I needed to prove with my voice. My grandfather had left records. The bank had preserved them. The doctor had verified them. My attorney had organized them. And now the court was seeing them. Finally, the judge looked toward my attorney. I want the original estate documents. My attorney stood. We have them. She reached for a sealed case beside her chair. I watched my parents. Neither of them spoke. The room became completely still. Because whatever was inside that case had been created long before this hearing. Long before Christmas Eve. Long before the trash bag. And long before my parents realized I had access to the life my grandfather had secretly protected for me. My attorney placed the case on the table. Then she opened it. And for the first time my parents looked genuinely afraid. The courtroom became completely silent when my grandfather's voice came through the speakers. For a moment nobody moved. Not my mother. Not my father. Not even the judge. Then that familiar voice filled the room. If you are hearing this, then something has gone badly wrong. I had heard those words once before, alone inside the bank. But hearing them here was different. Now other people were listening. People who had spent years hearing a completely different story about my grandfather. My attorney stood beside the evidence table and explained that the recording had been preserved according to the instructions in his estate documents. My parents' attorney immediately objected. He questioned when the recording had been made. He questioned whether my grandfather had been fully aware of what he was saying. He questioned whether the recording could be trusted. My attorney did not argue. She simply placed the supporting records in front of the judge. The date of the recording, the legal file connected to it, the professional witnesses, the medical evaluation, everything matched. Then the recording continued. My grandfather's voice sounded calm. He spoke slowly, as though he had thought about every sentence before saying it. I have made these decisions willingly. A pause followed. I understand my property. I understand my financial affairs. I understand who I want to benefit from them. My mother lowered her eyes. My father shifted in his chair. I kept looking at the table. I did not need to look at them. I already knew what was happening. The man they had described as confused was speaking more clearly than anyone in that courtroom. My grandfather continued. He explained that he had reviewed his estate plans with professionals. He explained that he had updated them more than once. He explained that he had taken steps to prevent anyone from changing his decisions through pressure or manipulation. Then he said something that made my hands go cold. I know there may be disagreement after I am gone. The recording paused for several seconds. If that happens, I do not want my granddaughter to argue with anyone. I looked up. The judge was listening carefully. My grandfather continued. Let the documents speak. Those words seemed to settle over the courtroom. My attorney then began introducing the documents one by one. There were legal records showing that my grandfather had met with attorneys. There were financial reviews showing that he understood the assets involved. There were medical records confirming that he had the mental capacity to make those decisions. There were signatures, witness statements, dates. Everything had been documented. My parents had spent years telling me that my grandfather had not known what he was doing. But the records showed that he had known exactly what he was doing. And he had known that someone might eventually question him. The judge asked to see one of the medical assessments. My attorney handed it over. The judge read it carefully. Then he looked toward my father's attorney. Do you dispute the physician's findings? The attorney hesitated. We believe there were concerns about his condition. The judge looked down at the document again. Concerns are not the same as evidence. Nobody answered. Then came the letters. My attorney explained that my grandfather had repeatedly attempted to communicate with me. She showed the dates, the messages, the copies of correspondence, the notes from his advisors. My parents had told me he had stopped asking about me. The records showed he had done the opposite. He had been asking where I was, why I was not visiting, why he had not heard from me, and he had been trying to reach me. The judge turned toward my mother. Did you receive these communications? My mother swallowed. I don't remember. My attorney placed another document on the table. The room became quiet again. It contained a record showing that my mother had been informed about one of the letters. Her attorney tried to object. The judge allowed the document to remain. My mother's face lost its color. I watched without satisfaction. There was no joy in seeing her cornered. Only a strange sadness. Because these were the same people who had taught me that my grandfather did not care about me anymore. Now the evidence was showing that he had been trying to reach me all along. My grandfather's recording continued. His final message was not about money. It was about me. I want her to have the freedom to make her own choices. His voice became softer. She has always been stronger than she believes. I lowered my eyes. For years, I had thought being strong meant surviving my parents' expectations. My grandfather had meant something different. He wanted me to be free from them. The recording ended. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then my attorney introduced the final portion of the evidence. She explained that my grandfather had anticipated challenges to his estate. He had created safeguards. He had preserved records. He had documented his intentions. And he had made clear that the inheritance was meant to remain protected from anyone attempting to control it. My father finally spoke. This doesn't prove she can manage that kind of money. The judge looked at him. No one has asked you to manage it. My father fell silent. That was the moment I realized the argument had changed. My parents were no longer trying to prove that my grandfather was confused. They were trying to find another reason to control what he had left me. But every new argument led back to the same evidence. He had known what he was doing. He had chosen me. And he had prepared for this. The judge gathered the documents in front of him. I have heard enough to understand that this matter requires careful consideration, he said. My attorney sat down. I remained still. There was no celebration. No victory speech. The courtroom was too serious for that. But as I looked across the room, I saw something I had never seen before. My parents had no story left that the documents could support. And then my attorney quietly leaned toward me. There is one final exhibit. I looked at her. What is it? She glanced toward the sealed evidence folder. It may explain why they were so determined to control the estate. She placed her hand on the folder. and I realized the truth about my parents was about to become much darker than I had imagined. The final exhibit did not show what my parents had said about me. It showed what they had been doing behind the scenes. My attorney placed the first document on the table. It was a financial record connected to my grandfather's estate. The judge looked at it. Then he looked at another. And another. I watched my father's face change. He knew what those papers were. My mother leaned toward her attorney and whispered something. Her attorney did not answer. My attorney spoke calmly. These records show repeated attempts to position the petitioners near assets they were not entitled to control. My father's attorney stood. Your Honor, that is an unfair interpretation. My attorney did not react. She simply turned another page. The room became quiet. There were records of meetings, requests for financial information, communications with people involved in my grandfather's affairs, attempts to influence how his decisions were described. None of the documents taken alone seemed dramatic. Together they told a very different story. My parents had not suddenly become concerned about my welfare after I received the inheritance. They had been concerned about control, and they had been preparing for it. I remembered my father's message. Whatever your grandfather left belongs to the family. At the time I had thought it was anger. Now I understood that he had spoken as though ownership had already been decided. The next document was worse. It showed communications about my grandfather's mental condition. My parents had repeatedly described him as confused and incapable. But the dates mattered. Some of those statements had been made shortly before professional evaluations confirmed that he was mentally capable of making financial decisions. My attorney explained the difference. They were not simply expressing private concerns. They were communicating these claims to people whose opinions could affect the estate. My mother shook her head. That isn't true. The judge looked toward her. Please allow your attorney to speak for you. She stopped. I watched her hands. They were no longer steady. Then my attorney introduced another set of records. This time they concerned me. The private investigator. The photographs. The questions about where I lived. Where I went. Who I met. Whether I had spoken with the bank. My attorney explained that the investigation had started almost immediately after my parents learned that I had access to my grandfather's assets. My father looked toward the judge. We were worried about her. My attorney answered before the judge could. Then why was the investigator asking about her financial activity? My father said nothing. The judge looked at the report. I remembered seeing unfamiliar cars near my apartment. I remembered feeling watched. At the time, I had tried to convince myself that I was imagining it. Now I knew I had not been. The report contained dates, locations, descriptions. My parents had paid someone to follow me. The same daughter they claimed was too unstable to manage her own life was apparently important enough for them to monitor every movement. My attorney placed one more document in front of the judge. It contained copies of messages my parents had sent me. Some sounded concerned. Others were threatening. One message told me that refusing to cooperate would have consequences. Another warned me that I would regret turning against the family. My attorney did not need to explain much. The words were already there. The judge read them silently. Then he asked my father a question. Did you send this? My father hesitated. Yes. Why? Because she wasn't listening. The judge looked back at the message. Is that your explanation for the threat? My father opened his mouth, then closed it. His attorney leaned toward him. The courtroom remained silent. I sat still. I could feel my heartbeat, but I kept my hands folded. My attorney had warned me that this might happen. Not because she knew exactly what my parents would do. Because people who believe they are entitled to control someone rarely know when to stop. My parents had started with a family argument. Then they demanded access to money. Then they contacted me. Then they hired someone to watch me. Then they filed a petition claiming I was incapable. Each step had created more evidence. They had built their own trail. The judge reviewed another set of financial records. These showed attempts to move certain funds connected to the estate before the inheritance had been formally transferred. My father's attorney objected. The judge allowed the documents to remain. My mother looked at my father. For the first time, they did not look like a united front. They looked like two people trying to understand how much the other had already revealed. My attorney spoke quietly. The evidence suggests this was not simply a dispute over a daughter's welfare. There appears to have been a financial motive behind repeated efforts to control the estate and the beneficiary. Those words hung in the room. Financial motive. That was what my parents had spent years trying to hide. I thought about Christmas Eve. The trash bag. The $182. The way my father had told me I needed to learn how to survive without them. It suddenly seemed almost strange that they had become so interested in my survival once they learned what my grandfather had left me. Then the judge turned to the private investigator's report. He read several pages. His expression became more serious. Was the investigator hired by the petitioners? My father's attorney paused. Yes, Your Honor. After they learned of the inheritance? Another pause. Yes. The room seemed to shrink. My mother lowered her head. The judge looked toward my attorney. Are there additional investigative findings? My attorney nodded. There are. She opened a second file. These were discovered during the review of communications and financial records. She placed the papers down. I looked at them. I did not understand every detail, but I understood enough. There were more communications, more attempts to influence people, more questions about the estate, more efforts to create a story in which I was incapable and my parents were necessary. My grandfather had spent years building a wall around my future. My parents had spent years trying to find a way through it. And now, in their effort to prove that they belonged on the other side of that wall, they had left fingerprints everywhere. The judge finally closed the file. The petition is denied. My mother looked up sharply. My father stared straight ahead. I felt no urge to smile, no urge to celebrate. The room was simply quiet. The decision was not revenge. It was a boundary. But my attorney leaned toward me and spoke softly. This is not over. I looked at her. What do you mean? She opened the final page. Some of these records may require further investigation. I looked across the courtroom at my parents. For the first time, they seemed to understand that losing the hearing was only the beginning. Their own evidence had opened another door. And behind that door was everything they had tried so hard to keep hidden. I expected another account number, another property deed, another financial statement that would tell me how much my grandfather had left behind. Instead, I found a letter. It was waiting inside a small wooden box in the bank's secure archive. My attorney had received permission to open it after the court hearing. The box itself was simple. No expensive lock. No decoration. Just my grandfather's initials carved into the lid. I touched them with my fingertips. For a moment, I was no longer sitting inside a bank office. I was a little girl again, sitting beside him at his kitchen table while he showed me how to fix a broken watch. He had always been patient with small things. He believed that if you understood how something worked, you could stop being afraid of it. My attorney opened the box. Inside were several documents, a few photographs, an old watch, and one sealed envelope. My name was written across it. I knew the handwriting immediately. My attorney looked at me. You don't have to read it now. I want to. She pushed the envelope toward me. I opened it slowly. The letter began with something simple. He hoped I was safe. Then he explained why he had never told me about the full inheritance. He did not want money to become the center of my relationship with him. He wanted me to know him first. He wanted me to learn the value of work, kindness, patience, and judgment without believing that wealth made those things unnecessary. I read the next paragraph twice. He wrote that money could give a person choices, but it could not give them character. That was something they had to build themselves. I stopped reading. My eyes moved toward the window. For years, I had thought the inheritance was the answer to everything. It was not. It was only the door. My grandfather had left me something much harder to measure. He had left me permission to choose my own life. The letter continued. He wrote about my parents without insulting them. He did not call them cruel. He did not call them greedy. He simply wrote that some people confuse love with control. That sentence stayed with me. I had heard my parents say they were protecting me more times than I could count. But protection had never felt like freedom. It had felt like permission. Permission to work. Permission to spend. Permission to speak. Permission to make mistakes. My grandfather had understood the difference. He had written that if I ever reached a point where I felt trapped, I should remember that leaving was not failure. It was sometimes the first honest decision a person could make. I folded the letter carefully. My attorney remained quiet. Then she said, "He knew you." I looked at her. I thought he didn't. She shook her head. "I think he knew you better than you realized." That was the part that hurt, because I had spent years believing I had lost him before I ever understood what he had been trying to tell me. The legal consequences for my parents were moving forward. The court had denied their petition. Protective orders had been issued. Further investigations were examining the financial records and the evidence surrounding the estate. My parents could no longer simply say they had been worried about me. There were documents now. Dates. Messages. Financial records. Investigative reports. The story they had built around me was falling apart under the weight of facts. But I did not spend my days watching what happened to them. I had something else to do. I had to learn how to live without them. That was harder than I expected. For years, even simple decisions had been connected to what my parents might say. Where should I live? What should I buy? Who should I trust? What should I do with my future? Now nobody was standing over me. That freedom felt strange. At first, I almost expected someone to tell me I was making the wrong choice. Nobody did. I worked with professional advisors to protect the inheritance. I did not suddenly start spending recklessly. I did not buy a mansion. I did not try to prove anything. I bought a comfortable home. I created a quiet office. I made sure the financial structure my grandfather had created remained protected. Then I began rebuilding the parts of my life that had nothing to do with money. I made friends who did not know my financial situation. I spent time with people who asked how I was doing instead of what I owned. I learned that genuine support sounded different. It did not come with conditions. It did not demand obedience. It did not make me feel guilty for having boundaries. One evening, I sat alone in my new home with my grandfather's letter beside me. The old black card was on the table. Picked it up. It looked almost ordinary. That still amazed me. Something so small had carried the key to a future my parents had never known existed. But as I held it, I realized something. The card had not saved me. My grandfather's planning had not magically erased everything that happened. The evidence had not changed the past. What they had done was give me something I had never been allowed to have. A choice. I could stay. I could leave. I could forgive. I could keep my distance. I could build a life that belonged to me. For the first time, I did not need anyone's permission. I looked at the letter again. At the bottom, my grandfather had written one final thought. He said he hoped that someday I would stop seeing myself through the eyes of people who needed me to feel small. I closed my eyes. That was the inheritance I had needed most. Not the money. Not the properties. Not the investments. It was the chance to finally see myself through his eyes. As someone capable. Someone worthy. Someone who deserved to be free. And for the first time in my life, I believed him. The first night in my new home, I placed the old black card on the table and stared at it for a long time. It looked almost ordinary. That still surprised me. Something so small had carried the key to a life I never knew existed. I thought about the night I had left my parents' house. The trash bag. The $182. The cold air. The sound of the door locking behind me. At the time, I thought that was the moment my life had fallen apart. Now I understood something different. It was the moment their control over my life finally began to end. I walked through my new home slowly. There were still boxes everywhere. Nothing was perfect. The furniture was simple. The walls were mostly empty. But every room belonged to me. No one had chosen it for me. No one could tell me where something had to go. No one could walk into my room and demand an explanation for a decision I had made. For the first time, silence inside a house felt peaceful. I sat down near the window and looked at my grandfather's letter. His handwriting was still clear. His words were still gentle. He had never wanted the inheritance to become a weapon. He had never wanted me to use it to punish my parents. He had wanted something much simpler. Freedom. That was the word I kept returning to. Freedom to choose. Freedom to make mistakes. Freedom to leave. Freedom to say no. For years, I had confused obedience with love because that was what I had been taught. If I disagreed with my parents, I was ungrateful. If I made a decision without them, I was reckless. If I wanted distance, I was selfish. Eventually, I began to believe their version of me. That was perhaps the cruelest part. They did not have to destroy my confidence all at once. They only had to repeat the same story until I started telling it to myself. But my grandfather had never accepted that story. He had seen something in me that I could not see yet. And he had prepared for the day I would finally need to see it too. The legal process continued after the hearing. My parents faced serious consequences for their actions. The protective orders remained in place. Investigators continued examining the financial records, communications, and other evidence connected to their attempts to interfere with the estate. There were no dramatic speeches from me. I did not stand outside the courthouse and celebrate. I did not tell reporters that I had one. There was nothing I needed to prove anymore. The documents had already done that. My parents had spent years telling people that I was incapable of managing my own life. Then they tried to prove it in court. Instead, they exposed their own actions. They had claimed they wanted to protect me. The evidence showed they wanted control. They had claimed my grandfather was confused. His record showed he was prepared. They had claimed I was unstable. The doctor who reviewed my history found no basis for their story. They had claimed they were worried about my future. Yet they had hired someone to follow me after discovering what my grandfather had left behind. Their own choices had destroyed the story they created. I did not have to destroy it myself. That was the strange beauty of the truth. Could stand on its own. Weeks passed. Then months. Slowly, my new life stopped feeling temporary. I learned how to manage the practical side of my inheritance with trusted professionals. I made careful decisions. I kept my grandfather's safeguards in place. I did not suddenly become a different person because I had money. I was still the same woman who had walked into that bank with a suitcase. The difference was that I no longer believed being alone meant being powerless. I began building relationships that had nothing to do with wealth. People who did not care what my accounts contained. People who listened when I spoke. People who respected the word no. People who did not make love feel like a debt. Eventually, I began to understand why my grandfather had been so careful. He had not simply been protecting money. He had been protecting my ability to choose who I became. One evening, I opened the drawer beside my bed and found the old black card. I held it in my hand. Then I remembered his voice. Use it only when you have nowhere else to go. For years, I had thought he meant a physical place. A house. A bank. A safe room. But I finally understood that he had meant something bigger. There might come a day when I had nowhere left to turn. And on that day, he wanted me to know that I was not trapped. I had a way out. I looked around my home. The quiet rooms. The soft light. The photographs I had chosen. The life I had built. And I realized something that no bank statement could ever show me. My grandfather had not left me a fortune because he thought I was weak. He had left it because he believed I was strong enough to use freedom wisely. That difference changed everything. I no longer measured myself by the things my parents had said. I stopped asking whether I was good enough, smart enough, responsible enough. I started asking a different question. What kind of life do I want? The answer did not come all at once. But I knew where it began. With peace. With honesty. With people who did not need me to be smaller so they could feel bigger. And with the memory of a man who had believed in me long before I had learned how to believe in myself. My grandfather's greatest gift was never the $63.8 million. It was the message hidden beneath it. You are allowed to choose your own life. I finally understood. I had never been the unstable daughter they described. I had never been the worthless burden they wanted me to believe I was. I had simply been a woman who had spent too long listening to people who needed her to doubt herself. And now I was free. Not because I had defeated them. Not because I had become richer than they ever imagined. I was free because their version of me no longer mattered. The girl who walked away from that house with $182 and a trash bag had believed she had lost everything. She had been wrong. She had finally found herself. And sometimes that is the inheritance that matters most. If someone you trusted tried to convince the world that you were incapable just so they could control your future, would you stay silent and let the evidence speak? Or would you confront them immediately? Tell me what you would do. And if you enjoy stories about betrayal, hidden truths, quiet strength, and hard-earned justice, subscribe. There are more stories waiting for you.